Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. Today, I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. And now let's get into the show. All right. Hello, everybody. Today I am speaking with Mac Lyman. Mac uses she and her pronouns and was born and raised in Colorado, otherwise known as Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute land. She is passionate about organizing people around their privileged identities, especially people who, like her, have race and class privilege. She is honored to be able to do this work with the beautiful cross-class, multiracial communities at Resource Generation, and also with the Chinook Fund since 2007. Mac works as a trainer, facilitator, and coach with the purpose of moving her people towards collective action. Additionally, and accidentally, Mac became a master bicycle mechanic and has taught thousands of people to fix bikes. And she intentionally lives with many of her favorite people in a shared community home called Sleep Tight. She likes building infrastructure for a regenerative economy, being a good neighbor, asking questions, and making people laugh. And so I'm so excited for you all to be able to hear from Mac. And just a little bit of context, Mac and I met through this really beautiful community called Rad Planners. We were both a part of the Becoming a Radical Advisor track, which is made up of radicalized, politicized people who want to infiltrate the financial services industry to basically transform it. And so within this group, Mac helped me host this workshop called Becoming a Radical Advisor. And Mac, as I got to know you a little bit better, I really remember thinking that you have such a cool perspective, and I just really appreciated both like how down you were and you were just willing to help make things happen. And then I discovered you were on the board of RG, that you'd been on your own wealth redistribution and personal transformation journey. And so I was like, aha, one of my people, this makes sense. So I'm really grateful for you, Mac, to share more of your story and your own journey. And so, Mac, I just want to ask, is there anything that you want to share before we get into it? Maybe you could introduce yourself with your name and something that you're prioritizing in this season of your life.
Yeah, hi, Jordan. So excited to be here on this interview and supporting with your podcast. My name is Mac Lyman. I use she and her pronouns. I live in Denver, Colorado. I sometimes feel embarrassed to say I've lived in the same neighborhood within the same 6 blocks now for 20 years. And I feel really rooted here, really grounded. Also going through a lot of transitions in my life and been thinking about different ways to share out some of the things that I've learned, some of the things that I've seen happen. I feel really excited that I got to join radical community as a very young person and was really inspired by the people I perceive to be elders who really shared what they learned, that this is important. I know things, I want to share it. But also I want to share it because I believe in other people being able to learn from it, use it, take what makes sense and leave behind the rest. So it's funny, I'm 42 years old, but I am routinely in spaces where people say to me as a movement elder. And so I'm trying to step into that and share what others have given me over the years.
I love that so much. And something that I really appreciate about the Resource Generation community that you've been a part of for so long, and for folks who are listening who aren't familiar with Resource Generation, it's a multiracial membership community of people around the ages of 18 to 35 who have wealth or class privilege, committed to the equitable and just redistribution of wealth, land, and power. And a practice that I learned through joining the RG community
was this concept called a money story. So I'm wondering, Mac, could you share a little bit more about what a money story is and your own money story, as much or as little as you feel like sharing? Sure. Yes, I love that resource generation has this practice and that it's also shared in many other spaces. But everyone in our culture has a money story, which is a way that money has moved through their lives and around their lives and interacted or not interacted with who they are. And I think for people with class privilege, with more than enough, often we spend a lot of time learning how to edit our stories or hide them. There's also often a lot of misunderstanding, confusion, intentional obfuscation. And so the practice of figuring out how to really talk about money and talk about money in a humanizing way, in a way so that we can reclaim money as a tool for good rather than a tool for exploitation and extraction is really important. And everybody of all class backgrounds has a money story. So one of the things I love about sharing my own is, I think, as a very young person, maybe I was 22 years old at a Resource Generations National Conference called Making Money Make Change in 2005, and was invited for the first time to share what I knew of my own money story. I've always, I think at that time especially, was terrified, oh no, what are people going to think about this? But I think the best thing about money is that they actually inspire people to reflect on their own stories, and everyone of every class experience has one. So my favorite thing about sharing them is that then I get to hear other people's money stories. So I hope that whatever I share inspires people to reflect on their own experience. If you also want to judge mine, that's fine too. I welcome that. But I was born in 1982 in a kind of elite resort town in Colorado called Steamboat Springs. And it was a little ski town. My dad had been raised kind of middle class with some owning class relatives. He had a rich aunt who paid for him to go to college to avoid the draft. And then also, he didn't avoid the draft, but he avoided going to Vietnam, and then also helped him move to Colorado after he was discharged from the Army. And he started a landfill business. He took over the city dump, basically. The year I was born, 1982, my twin brother and I were born. My dad named the landfill Twin Landfill Corporation. So one of the first things that happened to me as a person when I arrived on the earth is that a mountain of garbage was named after me and my twin brother by our father. And he sold part of a trash truck hauling company that year. And that year was also one of the biggest tax cuts in history of the United States under Ronald Reagan. So that year that he sold that company, more of that money went into his kind of his or our family's private bank accounts than would have certainly the year before, but really at any other year since the institution of income taxes in the United States. And I was born into a family with over $1 million. And my experience growing up in Steamboat Springs was both really beautiful and idyllic in a lot of ways. We spent a lot of time outside. It was a little town of about 7,000 people at the time, and close to neighbors, and a really well-supported local school structure, system and infrastructure. My family always had access to healthcare. My mom had been raised in Denver, Colorado, more of a working class experience. She and my dad married and were in terrible conflict for most of their relationship together, and divorced when I was pretty young, and also always kind of blamed their class difference for the reasons that they couldn't get along. So I both had an experience of being the boss's daughter. Everyone in Steamboat was a customer of the landfill by definition, because they all produced trash and had to throw it away. And then he was also just kind of he moved from New York City to Steamboat Springs in part to be kind of a big fish in a small town, is what he would say. And so I was really well known for that. And also I knew that we had the ability to travel and to take care of each other. And we had a safety net, a big house, and always warm. We didn't get new ski gear every year, but that's not because we couldn't afford it. It was just because that was kind of the culture of the place. So it's like you pass down your ski boots to the little kid who lives next door, and then the bigger kid who lives next door on the other side passes theirs to you. So this is just kind of like a community that was generally very well resourced. And some of the other really big things that happened, I think, in my childhood money story, resource generation shares often that the things that happen to us around age 12, maybe between ages 10 and 12, are often when our human brains are learning about money and really starting to be able to understand that concept of both comparison, but also about scarcity and abundance and about relationship to resources and access and those kinds of things. What happens around that time is often really influential on our experiences. And for me, a few things that happened around that time were one, that my older brother was arrested and our family was able to keep him out of jail, kind of lawyered up, and got a lot of social workers involved and was able to get him care and treatment as an alternative to prisons and policing. And I remember noticing even as a child that that seemed unusual. That was different from the stories I'd been learning from television or elsewhere about what happens when you get in trouble or do something wrong. It seemed like we were able to kind of build our own path for that. And another thing that happened is that I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is a very expensive, incurable, degenerative chronic illness. And my family was able to kind of get me access to really great care that was not only comprehensive for what was available at the time, but also kind of caring and respected my dignity and was able to kind of support me with feeling still hopeful about my future. And I think supporting my family as well, with them really coming to terms with their one of their young children having this disease to contend with at the time. I now have been type 1 diabetic I just celebrated my 32nd year. I throw a party every year on the anniversary of my diagnosis date. Sometimes I get them, like in resource generation, we talk a lot about numbers and money, but I also think a lot about numbers in general. And this year marks my 110,000th injection of insulin as well. So that's like another milestone in my life. So those were, I think, big things that influenced, especially as I grew older and became more politicized, really thinking about what are some of the ways that money was used in my life growing up, both the things that it afforded and allowed, but also really noticing what it made different in my life compared to most of my peers. So by the time I was a teenager and then in my early 20s and had become really politicized, I was really excited about the anti-globalization movements in 1999, 2000, 2001. And then also was living in Denver by that time and really moved by the movements led by the American Indian movement in Denver to transform the Columbus Day holiday, which had begun in Denver, and was really thinking about like what was different about my life and were there ways that I could be doing more to contribute to these movements and what other people were doing to create change, positive change in the world.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I just think of it as like this beautiful tapestry of like these different patterns that are different phases of our lives, like a golden thread or like a common thread that I'm really hearing. And that resonates with my own money story that people who follow some of my writings and work have heard some degree and will continue to hear more of. Is just, I think it really, for me, and I'm kind of hearing this in your story, is like realizing that what's possible for us is not possible for everyone, and feeling some type of, maybe it's cognitive dissonance, maybe it's just feeling some type of way around that. So I just really appreciate that about also being born into like a mound of trash, like a great visual. Thank you so much for sharing about just like the landscape of like who you are and where you came from. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about how did you get connected into like wealth redistribution, and maybe actually before we get into like the storytelling, could you just describe what wealth redistribution means to you?
Sure. Some of where my mind goes is thinking about, I think a lot of my life has been about figuring out how to balance like individual action. And especially because of the way I was raised, it was really pulled to be thinking about my individual experience, my individual needs, my individual desires, and that of the people around me. That kind of has a way of keeping things very small. And my understanding of the world, which is that it's huge and deeply interconnected. And so how to interrupt and push against the pull to focus on individual acts and make sure that I'm keeping in mind these bigger systems that are at play. I think some of why I share in my money story some of the pieces about my dad's, about tax, like tax policy, for example, is that was something that was happening in the background that had a huge influence on how and why my dad became a millionaire. And we love to tell the bootstrap story of he started his own business and he was both like lucky and also savvy or whatever those things are. But really mostly was driven by policy, purely by small business policy, by tax policy, by different public infrastructure that was built and supporting what he was doing, by the legal systems that were influencing what he could or could not own or have. I mean, the fact that land was something that he could own, it was youth land, still is, but that he was both like allowed and mandated by the Clean Air Act to start burying trash, that he could own that land and that he could have his ability to receive that money and keep it and enforce it was all, protected by our systems. So I think those things get lost. And I think when I think about redistribution, it's both about shifting money and resources and land and power and trying to make that more equitable in our world. I believe there's enough for everyone. It's a problem of distribution is what we're facing right now. But I also think we really need to be changing these systems because for every dollar that we give away in a kind of charitable or philanthropic model, that money essentially moves right back to the richest people. That's how our system is built right now. And so unless we're also dismantling and kind of like reworking the plumbing of how money moves through our society, we're going to keep reinforcing some of the same problems. Redistribution is the process of reaching for that belief that there is enough and we really just need to share it and changing the system as we go and relying solely on individual actions to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is resonating with me so deeply. Thank you. And I'm so curious to know a little bit more about how you came into this work, how that's evolved over time, and especially thinking through the lens of what you just named is like the individual actions paired with moving towards systemic change. So maybe if you could start with like, how did you get connected to resource generation? Like what brought you there? What were your intentions when you started out? This is 2005, and you're an elder now. So yeah, curious like how that has evolved, and then kind of like within that, how you were thinking about the individual versus the systemic change and how you're thinking about that now.
Yeah. I tend to tell a different story, I guess, depending on my audience. But I think that there was a part of me as a young child who always was a little bit hurt by the way money was used. I think it created distance between my family members. I think that it was used often to control each other, to separate each other. And I think that there was so much deceit and dishonesty in my childhood that when I first learned about some kind of anti-capitalist politic, I was like, all right, yeah, sign me up. Like, I'm in. As a teenager in punk community or an activist community, I was really drawn to what felt like a truth-telling about capitalism being built on and relying on inequality, and about some of the ways that it stood to dehumanize and separate us. And also, I think some of it echoing back to the stories that my parents had told, oversimplifying their conflicts to say, well, we just come from different class backgrounds. We don't really understand each other. We can't actually work together. And there was a part of me that was like, wait a minute. Not only does that not work for me, I'm like a mixture of both of you. So what does that mean about me internally? And then also, what does that mean about my ability to be in the world and to love my family members even? Like, here's my aunt who has a very different experience on my mom's side than my cousin on my dad's side. Can we never work together? Can we not care for each other? Can we not see each other? And so I think finding community where people were like, no, fuck capitalism. I was like, yeah, that there's something, I don't even know what that is, but that feels right to me. And I was drawn to it. I moved into an anarchist commune when I was 20 years old. And I think, even though we're talking about systems change, that was kind of like floating around in the background of the politic around how that little community functioned. But I really was moved by individual actions that people were taking. One of them is remembering, we ran like a little bicycle co-op out of our garage. This is where I started to learn bicycle mechanics. And there was one member of the house, this is probably 25 punks smashed into a little house we all rented together. And I was always on the lease because I was like, oh, this is a thing. Like I'm good at this. I understand like leases and talking to rich people. And this is something I can offer the community. But I didn't really know how to talk about money or what else to do. And I remember a friend coming home one day and saying like, hey, y'all, it's my birthday next week. And my mom sent me a check in the mail and it was for $25. And she opened it up in the kitchen and said, hey, well, like what supplies do we need for the bike co-op? Like, should I go buy patches and rubber cement? She just like it was so simple and no nonsense to her of just like, well, duh, this is all of ours. And what do we need most right now? And that level of transparency, I had never seen anything like that in my life. So much of the story of talking about money growing up was like, we don't talk about it, or we don't talk about how much we have. What do we need? So I was really influenced by that, like just seeing and noticing those little things around me all the time. And yeah, some of that led me to look up resource generation. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yes. And I was wondering, well, I want to have you back so we can talk about what it was like to live in a shared housing situation, especially a politically informed one. And I'm also just curious, when you got to resource generation, how did it feel in your body, or how did you receive it? What did you start with? And I'm curious, over the last like 20-ish years, what's changed for you, if anything?
So much has changed in 20 years, but my sense of gratitude for this community and the ways that it supported me has not changed. So it's been really consistent. I think I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but when I stumbled into that conference in Northern California in 2005, I think I actually hitchhiked there. Like, what a rich kid move. I was like, I'm just going to go to this rich kid conference. And like, I'm not telling anyone where I'm going. I just slept in a squat in an abandoned warehouse in Oakland the night before going. Like, what total cognitive dissonance. Like, I needed this conference so badly. I felt lucky that I hadn't been completely hidden in my experience of class privilege, in part because people knew me growing up. And so they knew I had a rich dad, and they knew that this landfill was named after me. I'm lucky in some ways that I didn't have the opportunity to hide more of it than I did, but I was experiencing a lot of internal turmoil about all of this. When I arrived, I think I instantly was like, oh yeah, these are the conversations I've been looking for. It's like, okay, we all believe in supporting Indigenous sovereignty. We've all been at these protests to support. And these are the other people who are like, oh, I'm realizing that I'm out here on this picket line or with this sign with this group, and my dad is inside the building or knows people who are. Like, what is that? What do I do? Like, how do I do this? It was really instantly a really powerful, cathartic, supportive, fun. I was excited to see a lot of other queer people and kind of punky people, and then also people who were thinking about this, like, how do we do this differently? I know that I'm going to inherit money someday, and I'm already sure that it's not mine. And so what do I do about that? And have to find people who are thinking the same things.
It's like that sense of belonging too, I think, is so important in any social justice work, but especially when you live in a world of we don't talk about money, society tells us to hide this part of ourselves. So having that belonging, I've experienced that being really special and important. I know that RG has several different frameworks that they invite us and the folks that we organize to incorporate into our own lives, into our own journeys. How did you start applying what you were learning or even just observing around the people around you? How did you start incorporating that into your own wealth redistribution or relationship with the people you were living with, just in your day-to-day life?
I think I mentioned had a rich dad. He was a millionaire the year I was born, but I never had a trust or a trust fund. I didn't have access to his financial wealth. Actually, really didn't until much, much later in my resource generation journey or in my understanding class privilege journey. In some ways, I'm really grateful for that because that meant that a lot of what I learned about and learned to focus on was my experience of class privilege. What are the privileges? What are the ways that I have been, because of having a rich dad, I've been able to navigate lots of different kinds of institutions. I understand hospitals. I understand schools. I understand courts. I know how to talk to landlords. I feel confident in what questions I can or cannot get away asking. And I also have, a safety net. And so I can take risks that other people can't. And even though I had never had to rely on that safety net, I knew it was there and I got to make decisions based on that. And I think that gave me a North Star of like, oh, if everyone had class privilege, we wouldn't need so much money. It's almost like the money is secondary to that in some ways. I mean, obviously money is necessary, an important tool. And if everyone knew that they could walk into whatever institution, if they could walk into a school and be taken seriously, if they knew that they could push back or quit a job because of the way they were being treated, if they knew that they could rest when they need to rest, if they knew that they were going to be able to get medication every time that they needed, what else would be different about the world? And also, how would we be better able to rely on each other, better able to show up for each other instead of having to rely solely on money? So I think that was huge for me. It was getting to be in resource generation through all of that, and was reinforced in some, key moments. I think as resource generation started to adopt campaign organizing as one of our organizing strategies, understanding we have to align ourselves with movements led by poor and working class people in order to change systems. That's going to be critical. And that, if we change these systems, we can be aiming for that piece of changing systems to eliminate classism. And then life is like cheaper, honestly. If you have class privilege, you don't need as much money. I mean, that's the irony too, right? Which is part of why it tends to concentrate and grow in just certain places rather than in others.
I know currently, the last few emails that we shared and the last few times we've caught up, you've been making some big moves yourself, both around divestment, reinvestment, I believe around getting access to your inheritance through your dad. And it sounds like you're doing really cool campaign work. So can you just share a little bit more about the recent developments or how you've approached that and what you're focusing on now?
Yeah, there's a lot of different experiments I've gotten to be a part of over the last 20 years, but I inherited $2 million from my dad this past summer. Some context is that my dad has always been a very kind of conservative, free market capitalism kind of guy. He's never into philanthropy or giving or thinking differently about investment strategies or any of those kinds of things. He's kind of like, I'm a job creator. That's my contribution to my community and to the world. And my job is to make the amount of money that I have grow. That's like my purpose in the world. And so I'm going to do that. And he has sure done it. And our economic system, financial system has surely helped him very, very much. So I spent a lot of years in resource generation trying to get him to give away money. I have made a lot of inroads there, but I at one point realized like, oh, if I have to wait to convince him to give away money, like this money is not really going to move. And he may never. And so I started thinking more about like, what are different ways that I can access what he has now? And then also realizing the more conversations I had with him about his plans for his estate, that his plan was to tie up these assets in trusts really in perpetuity. And so I was thinking, wow, I might inherit some of this money someday, but even then I'm not really going to be able to give it away, or I'm not going to be able to change how it's invested. It's going to stay in the S&P 500, or it's going to stay in traditional extractive investments. And I'm not going to have any control over that. I changed tactics. I didn't give up on trying to fundraise him. I still do, and I still have. But I changed tactics to actually trying to get him to change his will, so that if and when I inherit, I would actually have full control over those assets. And that's been somewhat successful. One of the twists is that my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's about 2 years ago. Some of what has happened as a result is that my stepmom and I and some other people have been really encouraging him to enact more of his will now, rather than waiting until he's not able to cognitively be aware of anything that happens with his money. And also because he has too much, way too much, way too much money. So I inherited this money, and I was able to actually inherit it in cash. And that's because of the work. It took about 6 years to convince him that it was really important to me that if I'm going to receive any inheritance from him, that it's something that I can do what I need to with it. That if it's going to be in my name, that I have to be able to take full responsibility for that. I take that very seriously. He was motivated by tax avoidance, as many wealthy people are. And I started to feel like, wait a minute, you're kind of just treating me like a tax shelter, which is a lot of how this system works. Like, inheritance is the act of essentially doing something to someone else, usually, your heir, usually a younger generation, without their consent. Like, inheritors don't actually get to agree to what happens to us. And I know that's like a boohoo, poor rich kid kind of thing. And also just like, no, there's so many like deeply, deeply not okay ways that type of like non-consent shows up in our culture. And this felt like a really big one to me. It was like, wait a minute, how is it possible that I don't have a say and that he gets to decide what happens to me and to my future and to then these assets that are in my name? That's not okay. And that he gets to say, oh, it's a gift. But it was like, wait a minute, Dad. I've never been good at gifts. Like I said, anti-capitalist since I was about 5 years old. I hated giving or receiving gifts. But there was one year that my dad gave me a pair of cowboy boots. I think I was like 25. And he had asked me like, well, I'm going to try and give you a birthday gift this year. What do you want? You always don't want anything. And I was like, that's true. And often I would try and get him to give money on my behalf to organizations. He'd be like, I'm not giving to that. They're into social justice. I don't support that. But this year he asked me for something and I said, you know what, Dad, I want a pair of cowboy boots. I had gotten into queer country Western two-stepping. I was turning into a gay cowboy, or I was like becoming the gay cowboy that I've always been. And so he was like, fine, I'll get you a gift certificate to the boot barn. And I remember referring to this later as he was like fighting with me, I think in front of his estate attorneys about, me being like, you can't do this to me. It's actually like, this is a boundary that I'm setting, that if I am going to inherit from you, I have to have full control over it. It's not okay with me. It's not okay for our relationship if you do that to me. And he was like, but it's a gift. Like, I'm giving it to you. And I was kind of like, no, Dad, this would be like if you said you were giving me cowboy boots, but then you only gave me one of them and you told me where I could wear it and who could touch it and what songs I could dance to. I was just like, that's not a gift. No one would consider that a gift. And so I, it was like trying so hard, throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing like, what is going to stick for this guy? And honestly, I think it stuck with his attorneys more than it did with him, that they were kind of like, oh, yeah, we've never questioned how we do this and the way these practices have come into being. And I had to sit there and remind them, like, these are practices that were created in relatively recent history and they can be recreated. And I am telling you that you cannot do to me what you have been doing. It's not okay. And so it started to work. I mean, it's more complicated and actually way more painful than it sounds in that story. And also it worked. And so it meant that instead of receiving inheritance in the form of assets that were co-owned by other people who I don't know or with whom I'm in deep conflict, or inheriting assets that were tied up in trusts that had deep restrictions over what could be done with them, I inherited $2 million in cash. And that meant then that I was able to give almost all of it away within just a matter of months. I was able to give away about $1.3 million in 3 months because I had done that kind of like pre-work. And otherwise, I think I would have been tied up for years. I mean, maybe decades trying to figure out how to untangle those resources in order to align them with my values and also with my commitments to redistribute at least 90% of my inheritance.
Yes. And that just thinking about the patriarchy that is embedded in the financial system and this like wealth supremacy world that we're swimming in, otherwise known as capitalism. I've seen documents where you have to, the beneficiary of this trust, the person that would receive the assets, has to be married to someone of the opposite sex, has to have a heteronormative relationship in order to receive those funds. And it is just so paternalizing. There's so much isms and phobias and supremacy baked in, and it's really appalling when you really get to the bottom of it. So the fact that you were able to do that family organizing, I can only imagine how much labor, emotional, spiritual, otherwise, that took. And wow, that is so amazing that you were able to do that. There's so much more I want to dig in to with you. And I know we are needing to start wrapping up, but I hope we can continue this conversation sometime in the future. So I think as we kind of end it, I would just love to leave folks who are listening with maybe just 1 or 2 lessons or guidance that you would share for someone who's like, oh, I'm really curious about this, or I'm curious about how do I get involved with like solidarity economy ecosystem, embodying my own values within social justice movements and heeding the calls of social justice movements. As an elder, what guidance would you share?
Yeah, as an elder, I think for me, the biggest overarching theme is about trying to figure out how to balance this individual redistribution efforts with long-term systems change work and movement building. So I think sometimes I give myself the goal of like at least 50% plus 1 of my time, that whatever amount that is of like my time, my energy, my resource is put into like the relationships and the organizations that are working to change the system. Because if our hopes and dreams of a future that is like well-resourced and where everyone has enough relies on individual like queer daughters of millionaires convincing them that they can't tie up their money for generations, we're never going to get there. Like it's not going to happen fast enough. And so that energy has to go somewhere else. It has to go into power building with millions and millions of people. So moving the money, like it's been really important for me and my integrity. And it's been really important for my ability to have a relationship with my dad. So I don't regret having done that. And I'm really, really glad that I've been able to stay connected to other organizations. So both like joining Resource Generation in their commitment to participating in campaigns for social justice, whether that was taxing the rich or valuing labor, or now RG's commitment to really back the Popular Democracy House Everyone campaign to decommodify housing, to create green social housing across the country. So there's not just, like continuing to work on individual projects of like small groups of people owning their house together, or like punks like me sharing my home, but looking at large scale, what are the corporations that own the majority of residential housing in the country, and how are we returning that ownership to tenants, to the commons? What are the ways that we're financing that at sustainable rates? What are the ways that we are supporting and like giving the power back to large communities of people to be able to control their own housing and resources. So I say, join your local housing justice campaign, find out who's doing that, go to meetings, like be on their email lists, show up to actions. And then especially for people who, like me, have class privilege, really looking at like, what are the other ways that I have to leverage my stories, to leverage my access or ownership? Maybe that's stocks or shares. Maybe that's proxy vote. Maybe that, well, anyway, lots of different things. Thinking about how can I show
in your backyard so people can
Mhm.
gather in a safe place. Yeah, there's so much we have to offer. And I think part of that too is it's healing. It's healing our legacy and our lineage. And I think even what you shared about what happened with your dad and his will is a form of, I know you didn't say this in your own words, but I think of that as a form of healing your relationship to one that's healthier and more supportive of the person that you want to be and the type of legacy that you want to lead too. And just thank you so much, Mac, for being on here, for sharing your story so beautifully and vulnerably. Mac also shared a lot of resources, group that she follows. Also, what Mac lifted up around the campaigns will be linked in the show notes, so check those out if you're interested. And that wraps us for today. So thank you so much, Mac.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.